You've been so wonderful to us.
During its first decade, KERA was known as the Little Red Schoolhouse of the Air, operating as the early broadcasting arm of the Dallas Independent School District.
Darren, your back is to the lights and the camera.
It wasn't until respected Dallas business and civic leader Ralph Rogers hired 26-year-old Bob Wilson in 1968 that KERA discovered its community voice, attracting national attention.
It was really Mr. Rogers' credibility that he put on the line that got the major grants in the beginning.
Together, Wilson and Rogers set in motion the groundbreaking nightly program, Newsroom.
I'm Jim Lair, and this is Newsroom, a program of local news, analysis, and opinion.
People still talk about that, and I think still room for that kind of a program.
During his more than 7 years at the helm of KERA, Wilson would also be credited with launching KERA 90.1. And along with former program director Ron DeVilliers, introducing Monty Python's Flying Circus to American audiences. Hello, I'm Lee Cullen. During the next half hour, I'll be joined by longtime friends and colleagues Jim Lehrer and Bob Ray Sanders in a tribute to Bob Wilson.
I think of Bob, and I just think that it was one of the greatest things that could have happened to this station at that time.
Bob Wilson, when you took over at KERA, it was a tiny station with no programming to speak of and no prospects, no nothing. How did Ralph Rogers ever persuade you to take this job?
Well, at that time I was working for him and as kind of a gopher. And,
the assistant to the president.
Assistant to the president, and he was interested in resurrecting this station and making it into something. So he said, why don't you work with me as I'm doing that? And the station, as you know, in those days wasn't anything like this. And so he said, let's go to work. And so we began and started thinking about it. And I had become friends with Jim Lehrer at the Dallas Times-Herald, and I thought one of the things we could do was to have Jim come on every week or so. And so he started to do that, and that's when things began.
That was an interesting moment. Jim had been city editor at the Times-Herald.
Exactly.
He wrote Viva Max, sold it to the movies,
right.
But he got tabled because of the assassination in Dallas.
That's
then
right.
it did finally appear, and he got a little bit of money and left the Times-Herald to do writing full time.
He called me and asked me if I would become a consultant to News and Public Affairs. And I said, well, great. Do you all do any News and Public Affairs programming? And he said, no, but we want to do some. And I'd only have to work 2 days a week, and it was perfect, because it was perfect to augment my income while I, did my writing. And then, lo and behold, that had barely begun when Bob had an idea. San Francisco had a newspaper strike. They took all the reporters and the editors and the editorial cartoonists and all the people from the newspapers and put them on television every night to kind of be a newspaper on, in fact, they called it that, newspaper on the air.
And they looked like reporters. They didn't, have makeup on, and it was a huge hit.
Funded by the Ford Foundation, the San Francisco Newsroom experiment would soon be expanded to other cities.
It was Bobby Wilson, who, I still call him Bobby, but you'll always
So does his wife, Laura.
Yeah,
so do we all.
He will always be Bobby to me. Anyhow, Bobby said to me, he said, well, what about trying Dallas? And I said, well, fine. So I wrote a proposal for the program for what we would do. It's called Newsroom. And because literally the program was broadcast from the newsroom, and we got very excited about it, but we also knew the chances of getting funded were not that great.
Now, were they skeptical about Dallas? It was only 6 years after the assassination of John F. Kennedy here. I mean, the world was skeptical about Dallas.
Yes, well, they were, and they said, what's going to happen when the mayor calls over there and tells you, we don't want them on the air, and we don't want you to give them the time? Mr. Rogers says, we're going to give the time to anybody who needs the time. He looked like America's CEO.
The Ford Foundation was convinced and gave KERA the green light. They gave you $500,000, and in today's dollars, it must have been about $4 million or more.
It was huge, and it was, bigger than the budget we had for the whole station. And they gave us enough time so that we could get the audience. And pretty soon we were part of this city in a way that many people really came to like.
It had an enormous impact on KERA, didn't it?
Oh, it did. It did. In fact, at that point, KERA didn't do any programming. There were occasionally some election specials and things like that, but there was no regular programming. And public broadcasting itself was still kind of finding its legs and trying to figure out what in the world are we here to do. And it had been created just in 1967 by the Public Broadcasting Act.
We want most of all to enrich man's spirit, and that is the purpose of this act. It will give a wider and I think stronger voice to educational radio and television by providing new funds for broadcast facilities.
By the end of the 1960s, KERA and other public broadcasters would be on the brink of innovative programming that showcased local journalism, as well as introduce children and families to Big Bird and Sesame Street. One of that show's 3 founding board members was Ralph Rogers.
Sesame Street had just gone on the air.
With Ralph Rogers' help.
With Ralph Rogers' help, exactly. And doing local news and public affairs was, up to that point, had not been something that had been on the drawing board.
Our coverage of the desegregation of the Dallas schools continues tonight with a specific look at how Judge Taylor's desegregation plan affects the Oak Cliff section of Dallas. Well, we received more than 650 feedback calls last night during the 2 hours plus that we were on the air with our special newsroom edition, explaining Judge Taylor's order and then the discussion that followed.
We did one, they did one in Pittsburgh, a newsroom in Pittsburgh, and they did a newsroom in Washington, D.C. They did one similar in Boston at WGBH. And we kind of got in the news and public affairs business, as you know, Lee, because you were one of them.
Yes, Lee.
Sorry, I just have a question for all
That's quite all
4
right.
of you.
Go ahead.
You know, you're all Oak Cliff leaders, but you're citywide leaders also. 3 of you were elected at large. Mr. Carpenter served on the city council, elected at large. You all came up through a mode of leadership that frowns on sectionalism, the Charter Association, the Committee for Good Schools. Do you feel torn in this matter? Do you feel you should join other city fathers and call for unity?
Oh, I think the city fathers should join us in this thing because we have one city.
I hired everybody, and everybody I hired was just like I was, absolutely ignorant about television. It showed, there's no question about it.
We were the most diverse group of people in journalism in Texas and in many parts of the country. I mean, I'm talking about in terms of ethnicity, in age, in background.
Oh, let me tell you how bad it was. Women had never appeared on a regularly scheduled news program. African Americans had not appeared. Hispanics had not appeared. Men with beards had not appeared.
Right.
We were horrifying.
East Texas accents, you know, and West Texas twang. We were not asked to leave any part of us behind. We were asked to bring everything with us. So when I came to Channel 13, I brought my blackness, I brought my Fort Worthness, I brought my passion for justice, and I was able to go out there and do what I thought should be done.
It was very controversial from the beginning, Newsroom, and for many reasons. What vexed the powers that be in Dallas the most?
That they would confront them with what they had to say. They were used to having people say, "Oh, yes, sir." There wasn't much yes, sirring from the newsroom crew.
Bob Wilson, with the support of Ralph Rogers, endured the pressures with grace and carried the station with deceptive ease.
They were daring years. Bob Wilson, this guy with this Boston accent, running around Dallas, sometimes in tennis shorts, coming into this station, invigorating it, I felt. When I saw him, I felt like that he was like the quarterback on a team, and the underdogs for sure, but that we could win the game. He came in here, I thought, in Dallas, Texas, and said, we're going to make this station work, and we're going to compete with the other stations. We may have a small audience. And then he still had to go out and raise money when he had a group of people on Newsroom upsetting a lot of the people that he had to go and ask for money for. I always thought, I said, how does he do this? How does he let us do what we do, and he still go out there and raise money?
They were going after the stories, and wherever the stories led, that's where they went. And that was disruptive, especially to some of the bankers here in town, and which ran over when PBS put on this Banks and the Poor, which was a documentary.
I remember it.
And we had, I mean, every banker in town was kind of after us. And I think it was Bobby Stewart
At First National, the old First National
Bank. And he was a great guy, and he said, look, they're doing what they think is right. They have good people, and if we can't withstand what they say, then that's our problem, not theirs.
And you remember the commissioner's court crowd was pretty free with racial slurs, and we simply quoted them correctly on Newsroom, which just put them into a rage.
Right.
But I got the impression that every time somebody downtown got upset, Bob Wilson got glad because he thought we were doing our jobs. We were doing what we said we were going to do. We were going to do what the other stations didn't dare do. And that was to report accurately, to raise questions that other people had not raised, and to put them on the air live. And here we were raising the issues and not being afraid to do that.
The free flow of local news in Dallas was pretty much controlled by these two competing but hugely powerful newspapers, the Dallas Morning News and the Dallas Times-Herald. And our little broadcast came in the middle of all of this, and we became kind of a watchdog in a strange way, not openly and not intentionally, but stories that, well, the Times-Herald's not going to do this, so the news won't do it. Well, uh-oh, but those fools over at KERA may do the story. So in other words, a lot of stories got freed up in the chain of command at the two newspapers just because we existed. And if there were also sometimes when some reporters couldn't get a story in one of the papers, and they'd give it to us.
I guess that was part of what was really the exciting part of what we were all trying to do, is trying to bring a new level of journalism to this town that had not existed. And that included investigative journalism, certainly that had not been done in television and very little done in newspapers of important institutions.
And remember, the News owned Channel 8, the Times-Herald owned Channel 4, Fort Worth Star-Telegram owned Channel 5. It only took 3 calls to kill a story if you wanted to.
That's right.
And you did the story.
He would have to sever in order to be mayor. He serves on the
It was hell every day. Getting on the air every night was a chaotic experience. Leading up to it, we'd have editorial meetings and people screaming and hollering at everybody, and it was right in the middle of politically. There were all kinds of tough politics here in Dallas at the time and in the country at large because of the Vietnam War and all kinds of other issues.
We'll spend the next half hour with Doris Kearns in her book, Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream.
The American people are really going to find one of the most interesting presidents we have ever had. And yet right now there's a general feeling of not even knowing that, of thinking that the Kennedys are more interesting, or even, for God's sakes, that Nixon's more interesting. And that's incredible and wrong.
People came into the studio, famous people, poor people. That was the other thing. We were reaching an audience of the decision makers because they didn't know what we were going to say about them, but we also the audience of the people who had no voice, because we gave them voice. And I thought that was one of the best things that we could ever do for a city like this at the time in which we were living, when there was a lot of strife, integration problems, police and community relations problems. A lot of those problems got solved in this studio where we sit right now.
Would you say that was the area of greatest impact for Newsroom, race relations, school desegregation?
Without a doubt. We started the town hall meetings.
There's a correlation between this business of busing and where people live. We're going off the air. If we have this, we're going to cut off the air.
We could get a quorum of the school board in this studio. We could get a quorum of the city council. We could get people who did not talk to each other all week and bring them together. I know for a fact that race relations were eased or made more compatible because of what we did by being able to invite people, but we were respected enough that they would come.
Under Wilson's leadership, KERA's coverage of the 1972 political elections earned the Columbia DuPont Award, considered by many broadcast journalism's most prestigious accolade.
People still talk about that. And I think there's still room for that kind of a program.
I would say that you're absolutely right. Born in Belmont, Massachusetts, Bob graduated from Dartmouth. Soon after, he and wife Laura moved to Dallas, where Bob first went to work for the Scott Paper Company. Together, they raised their 3 boys, Andrew, Owen, and Luke.
They loved coming down here, and they still remember those days.
It was in Dallas where Bob first met influential Republican businessman Ralph Rogers, who would later become the founding chairman of PBS. Ralph Rogers was a formidable and powerful man. How would you describe him?
He was a realist, but he was also unafraid in situations. He didn't like many of the things that we broadcast, but he came to understand that it had to be open, and if there was any hint of censoring, then the station would lose its reputation.
And remember when Nixon was trying to kill public television, he tried to cut the money. He did everything he could to kill public television with Clay Whitehead, his henchman.
Oh, that's right.
It was Mr. Rogers who took over and became head of PBS.
Yeah.
Really saved the show.
He really did.
At this very difficult point in the life of our republic, it is still possible for the world to see the Congress, the administration, and the people join with each other in assuring the future of public broadcasting for all our people. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you very much, Ralph. Very fine statement.
I think if we hadn't had Watergate, they might have been successful in doing away with the funding of public broadcast, because Pat Buchanan was at the White House, the Nixon White House, and he was determined to do it, to implement what Clay Whitehead wanted, and I think they would have done it. But after Watergate happened, they just had too many other fish to fry, and frying public broadcasting wasn't one of them.
With the funding battle over, Rogers and Wilson continued to expand KERA services to North Texas. And in July 1974, they launched a public radio station.
KERA, FM 90, KERA.
I loved KERA FM because I like radio. The difference in cost between TV and radio was pretty profound. It was something that you had a tremendous impact with, but the costs weren't anything like television.
We signed on right after Newsroom. I think we had saved the last 5 or 7 minutes of Newsroom. They had put a switch in the back of the studio. You were at the head of the table here, and at some point toward the end of the show, we had done the feedback, and you said, and now we're going to do something very special. Bob Wilson came in. I think Ralph Rogers was there. Tony Garrett was a program director at the time. Bruce McKenzie was the manager. He was here in this studio, but Tony was over in the 90.1 studio, the little wooden shack, and we actually pulled a switch here in this studio to sign on 90.1. Put an ad in the paper, said the birth of a station, and it was begun.
With more than 30 music stations in North Texas, 90.1 offered a diverse array of programming. The station broadcast classical music in the afternoons and jazz late at night, and also laid the foundation for bringing All Things Considered and Morning Edition to North Texas.
I'm Bob Edwards. Public radio works because you make it work. Your support of KERA pays for all of the NPR programs you listen to and depend on every day.
The community embraced it. We did extraordinary programming and even involved the community. We did something called the Saturday Blockbuster that would take a theme and for 12 hours just go nonstop. And often community people were involved in that.
One of the earliest board operators was Glenn Mitchell, who by 1976 was hosting and producing The Morning Magazine, a 2.5-hour program featuring a mix of talk, music, and news. And for more than 30 years, Mitchell's Christmas Blockbuster, an annual marathon of holiday music, history, and trivia, was also an indispensable feature on 90.1.
Okay, it's 11:17 on the Christmas Blockbuster. Here's a quick Christmas quiz for you. Now, don't call in. There's no prize. This is strictly for your own personal glory.
I loved radio because it was a relief from fundraising. Television is so much more expensive.
Well, you've been interested in the arts all along, and Patsy Swank was the great leader in the arts at KERA, going back to Newsroom, where she covered the arts.
Yeah. She held the flag on Newsroom, all the things that would come to town.
You said, I believe, that no artist should try to understand himself too well.
I don't want to be psychoanalyzed. I don't want to be told what makes me tick.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that if you know too much of something, then it loses its surprises and things. or you begin trying to prove that something that somebody might have thought they found out about you is wrong.
Bob, KERA was the first station in the country to air Monty Python. How did you pull that off?
Well, it was Ron DeVilliers who really was the person behind that. And he was on Newsroom, and then after a couple of years, he became the head of programming. I'll never forget, he was down 2 or 3 doors from me, and I hear him yell, "Wilson, wait till you see this."
So I started watching these shows, and I mean, it was just unbelievable. I was mesmerized. All I can tell you is that I was in tears much of the time, with laughter. And I literally had sat there all day and watched those shows.
He brought up the Monty Python that he had sent away for. It was fantastic and something I had never seen the likes of it.
I wondered how in the hell I was going to get it on TV, because it was very rude for Dallas, Texas in the 70s. But I had one piece of good fortune, and that is that the manager of the station was a guy by the name of Bob Wilson. And he was this Boston Irish Catholic and with a raging sense of humor.
Channel 13 was kind of run by my dad and a few of these other guys that were kind of, I would guess, more liberal than most people. And it was also in Dallas, Texas at the time, which is, you know, was and is a conservative place. I really felt like the only people that watched Channel 13 were my dad and the other guys that were on it.
I'm a lumberjack and I'm okay. I sleep all night, I work all day.
We introduced Monty Python to America, and they came and did an evening with us live.
Okay, we want to welcome our audience. We are obviously here with members of the Monty Python Flying Circus Troupe. You know that better than I do. I'll introduce them to you, though they don't really need an introduction. Maybe the names. Michael Palin. Seated next to him is Terry Jones, Terry Gilliam, and Graham Chapman.
It was amazing, because, you know, we also did pledge drives around the programs. And I was often there on Sunday nights doing pledge drives around Monty Python. And it was very clear to me that what Monty Python had done for Channel 13 was to bring a totally different audience than we had the rest of the week. I mean, when you get those phone calls on pledge night, and it's these young people, number one, but far out people, I thought. But there was part of the excitement about it, is that we brought a new audience to public television.
Most of our ratings were minus 0.3, which means it's so small, we can't even measure it. And we went through the normal stuff, and Masterpiece Theater was there with a 1.5, and we went to that Sunday night at 10 o'clock, and the rating was a 6. Well, we had never seen a rating of 6, period.
By the end of 1975, Bob Wilson would be credited with bolstering KERA's reputation for solid journalism, unprecedented coverage of the arts, and broadcasting award-winning children's programs. What would have happened to KERA, that little red schoolhouse, if Bob Wilson and Ralph Rogers had never come along?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't be in public broadcasting. You and I probably would not be doing what we're doing right now. More importantly, I think that public broadcasting was growing and was going to come into its own anyhow. What Ralph Rogers and Bob Wilson did was expedite it and lead the way.
If you had to come up with one word to describe Bob Wilson, what would it be?
Maverick. Everything that he did in those early days was against the grain. I mean, for a city like Dallas. I mean, I understand that Newsroom, which was one of 4 in the country at the time, in Dallas, even the Ford Foundation didn't expect it to work. But because of Bob Wilson and what he was allowed to do and the people he gathered around into this one place, he went against the grain. I mean, Maverick. And of course, and now when I see these sons of his in the movies, and I remember when they used to run around here as children, you know, and I can say, you know, I see Bob all over again. because, you know, the maverick. Other words come to mind. Visionary, without a doubt. He had a passion that was just incredible, I thought. And he had a vigor. You know, he was vibrant. He was full of life.
In 1975, Bob Wilson left a now emboldened KERA to start his own communications company, continuing his passion for history and the public forum.
The thing that I was proudest of is that the station was a contender for people's attention and respect, and it was, had a tradition of running programs that in many parts of the country would not be run. And we established a tradition that the audience could make up its mind, and that we didn't feel that we had to be some sort of master censor.
Over the years, Wilson has given a lot to good writing, and perhaps his best-known effort is Character Above All, a collection of essays he edited on American presidents from Franklin Roosevelt to George H.W. Bush. The truth is that character above all is a phrase that was made by Bob Wilson without realizing that it should be applied first and foremost to him. I'm Lee Cullum.
People ask me almost every week, can you ever bring back Newsroom? I don't know that it will ever work again. But if you could, I think it would be of incredible service. But I just don't see a time that it can ever come back.
In another of your books, you acknowledge Laura Wilson, your wife, the photographer, for her example, for you and for your son.
For the sons.
What were those examples?
I thought Laura, raising 3 boys and then becoming an outstanding photographer, and she was able to balance all these things. I don't really know how she did it because, they were wonderful boys, but 3 boys it's a handful. She was exceptional as a mother, and now her photography is flourishing.
This program was made possible by the valued support of KERA members. Thank you.